Picture this, it's 2 a.m. in the underground war rooms beneath London. The Blitz is raging overhead, German bombs are literally falling on the city. And Winston Churchill is sitting in his chair, smoking a cigar, sipping whiskey, and dictating correspondence to an exhausted secretary who's been working for 18 hours straight. This wasn't unusual. This was basically every night. Churchill slept odd hours, worked from bed, drank throughout the day, took 2-hour baths where he continued working, and had a personal staff that lived in a state of perpetual exhaustion trying to keep up with him. He was 65 years old when he became Prime Minister, an age when most people are thinking about retirement. He would lead Britain for 6 years through the most existential crisis in its history, and he did it while maintaining habits that would hospitalize most people. We think we know Winston Churchill. The bulldog. The voice that rallied Britain when all seemed lost. The man who stood alone against Hitler. The icon of British determination with the cigar and the V4 victory sign. But strip away the legend, and you find someone far stranger, a man who battled severe depression his entire life, who was a spectacular failure for decades before his moment came, who was reckless with money and other people's lives, who held views on race and empire that are shocking even for his time. And yet who possessed some quality of character and rhetoric that made him the right person at the single most important moment. Today, we're diving into who Winston Churchill really was as a person. Not the statue. Not the myth. But the complicated, brilliant, infuriating, deeply flawed human being. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born on November 30, 1874, into one of Britain's most aristocratic families. His father was Lord Randolph Churchill, a brilliant but erratic politician. His mother was Jenny Jerome, a beautiful American heiress. On paper, young Winston had everything. In reality, he had parents who barely acknowledged his existence. This wasn't unusual for aristocratic Victorian families. Children were raised by nannies and governesses, shipped off to boarding school as soon as possible. But even by those standards, Winston's parents were remarkably distant. His mother was busy with her social life and numerous affairs. She was one of the great society beauties of her age and took full advantage of it. His father was consumed by politics and his own demons. Churchill wrote letters to his mother from boarding school begging her to visit. She rarely came. He idolized his father desperately, craving his attention and approval. Lord Randolph mostly ignored him, and when he did pay attention, it was usually to tell Winston he was a disappointment. There was one person who loved Winston unconditionally, his nanny, Mrs. Everest. She was the emotional center of his childhood, and when she died in 1895, Churchill was devastated. He paid for her funeral and visited her grave for the rest of his life. This childhood left scars. Churchill spent his entire life desperately seeking approval, recognition, and love. He needed to be the center of attention. He needed to be important. The little boy writing letters his mother wouldn't read became the man who would dominate every room he entered. Here's something that surprises people. Churchill was a genuinely bad student. Not just uninterested, he was near the bottom of his class at Harrow, one of England's most prestigious schools. He failed the entrance exam to Sandhurst Military Academy twice and only passed on the third attempt. It wasn't that he was stupid, Churchill was clearly brilliant. But he was defiant, stubborn, and only interested in what he wanted to learn. He had a photographic memory for things that fascinated him and complete indifference to everything else. He hated mathematics, hated Greek and Latin, and made no effort to hide his contempt for subjects he found boring. His father was disgusted by his academic failures. Lord Randolph wrote him letters saying Winston was too stupid for law or politics and should just go into the army since it required less intelligence. This devastated Churchill, who worshipped his father. Then, when Churchill was 20, his father died at age 45, probably of syphilis, after a rapid mental and physical decline. They never reconciled. Churchill spent decades writing about his father, trying to rehabilitate his reputation, essentially continuing a one-sided conversation with a man who had never really seen him. After Sandhurst, Churchill was commissioned as a cavalry officer, but peacetime military life bored him absolutely senseless. What he wanted was action, glory, and recognition. So he did something extraordinary. He essentially went war tourism. Cuba was fighting Spain for independence. Churchill talked his way into going as a military observer at age 20. He got shot at on his 21st birthday, loved the excitement, and wrote newspaper articles about his experiences. The northwest frontier of India had fighting. Churchill pulled strings to get himself posted there in 1897, participated in combat, and wrote a book about it called The Story of the Malaccan Field Force. South Africa had the Boer War. Churchill went as a war correspondent. Got captured, escaped from a POW camp in an adventure that made him famous across the British Empire, and wrote another book. This wasn't just youthful adventure-seeking. Churchill needed glory like other people need air. He threw himself into danger with almost suicidal recklessness, and part of it was genuinely believing he was destined for greatness, that he wouldn't die because history had plans for him, but there was something darker too. Churchill throughout his life had periods of deep depression that he called his black dog. Even in these early years, he seems to have been driven by something, a need to prove himself, to matter, to outrun some internal darkness. Churchill had absolutely zero modesty. In his books about these military adventures, he wrote about his own bravery, his own brilliance, his own importance with a complete lack of self-consciousness that was remarkable even for Victorian England, when he participated in the cavalry charge at the Battle of Andaman in the Sudan in 1898, one of the last great cavalry charges in British military history. He wrote about it in such self-aggrandizing terms that his fellow officers were embarrassed for him. He didn't care. He knew what he was doing, building a reputation, making himself famous, creating the legend of Winston Churchill, and it worked. By his mid-20s, Churchill was famous throughout the empire as a warrior-writer-adventurer. His escape from the Boer POW camp made him a national hero. He parlayed that fame directly into politics, winning a seat in Parliament in 1900 at age 25. This was the pattern of Churchill's early life: spectacular ambition, shameless self-promotion, genuine courage mixed with reckless disregard for danger, and an absolute conviction that he was destined for greatness. Churchill entered Parliament as a Conservative, like his father. Within 4 years, he switched to the Liberal Party. This was seen as betrayal, and Conservatives hated him for it for decades. Churchill didn't care. He disagreed with Conservative policy on free trade, and he saw better opportunities for advancement with the Liberals. This tells you something important about Churchill. He had principles, genuinely held beliefs, but he also had enormous ambition and remarkably little loyalty to party or colleagues when they conflicted with his own advancement. He rose quickly in the Liberal government, becoming president of the Board of Trade at 33, Home Secretary at 35, and First Lord of the Admiralty, in charge of the Royal Navy, at 37. By his late 30s, Churchill was one of the most powerful men in Britain. Then came World War I, and Churchill's brilliant career crashed spectacularly. As First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill was instrumental in pushing for the Gallipoli campaign in 1915, an attempt to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war by attacking through the Dardanelles Strait. On paper, it looked brilliant: avoid the stalemate of the Western Front, open a new route to Russia, potentially end the war years earlier. In reality, it was a catastrophe. The naval attack failed. The subsequent land invasion turned into another bloody stalemate. By the time the campaign was abandoned in early 1916, over 140,000 Allied soldiers were dead or wounded. Churchill was blamed. It wasn't entirely fair. Many people had supported the campaign, and the execution was botched by military commanders, but Churchill had been the loudest advocate. And he took the fall. He was forced to resign from the Admiralty in humiliation. This destroyed him. Churchill fell into deep depression. He was 40 years old, and his brilliant political career seemed over. He'd gotten tens of thousands of men killed in what looked like a vainglorious strategic gamble. Here's what's remarkable: Churchill went to France and served as an officer in the trenches. He didn't have to, he could have stayed in Parliament, but he felt he needed to share the danger of the men who'd fought in his failed campaign. He spent several months commanding a battalion on the Western Front, under artillery fire, in the mud and horror of the trenches. Churchill eventually made it back into government. He was too talented and too ambitious to stay away, but Gallipoli haunted him. In the 1920s, he was Chancellor of the Exchequer and made disastrous economic decisions that many blamed for worsening Britain's economic troubles. Then in 1929, the Conservatives lost power, and Churchill was out of government. He would stay out for the next 10 years, his wilderness years. These were the 1930s, and Churchill spent them being wrong about almost everything except the one thing that mattered most. He supported Edward VIII during the abdication crisis and damaged his reputation. He made terrible investments and was perpetually on the verge of bankruptcy. Living far beyond his means in his country house Chartwell, but Churchill also saw, earlier and more clearly than almost any other British politician, that Nazi Germany was an existential threat. While most of the British establishment was pursuing appeasement, Churchill was warning that Hitler couldn't be negotiated with, that war was inevitable, that Britain needed to rearm immediately. He was dismissed as a warmonger, a has-been clinging to past glories, a man whose judgment couldn't be trusted after Gallipoli. Politically, he was isolated and irrelevant, and then, in September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain declared war. And suddenly the warmonger didn't seem quite so crazy. In May 1940, after the disaster of Norway, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain resigned. King George VI wanted Lord Halifax as the new Prime Minister. The King didn't like or trust Churchill. But Halifax wouldn't take the job. That left Churchill. On May 10, 1940, at age 65, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of Great Britain. That same day, Germany launched its invasion of France and the Low Countries. Within 6 weeks, France would fall. Britain would stand alone against Nazi Germany. Churchill later wrote about that night, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. Everything, the desperate glory-seeking, the spectacular failures, the years in the wilderness, the warnings about Hitler that nobody heeded, it had all led to this moment." Churchill believed it, and he was probably right. Let's talk about how Churchill actually functioned on a daily basis, because it's genuinely bizarre. Churchill rarely got up before 11 a.m. He would wake up, have breakfast in bed, and immediately start working, reading papers, dictating correspondence, taking meetings, all while still in bed wearing a silk dressing gown. This could go on for hours. Then, around 1 p.m., he might get up. He'd have lunch, which always included wine. Then, around 3 or 4 p.m., he'd take a nap, not a short nap, but a proper sleep of an hour or two. He considered this essential and maintained this habit even during the war. After his nap, he'd get up, take a bath. Churchill took very long baths, often over an hour. And he'd continue working in the bath, dictating to secretaries who had to sit in the bathroom with him. Then he'd have dinner, a long, elaborate affair with multiple courses and lots of alcohol. After dinner, often around 10 or 11 p.m., Churchill would really get going. He'd work through the night, sometimes until 3 or 4 a.m., dictating speeches, writing memos, holding meetings. His staff had to work in shifts to keep up with him. He drank throughout all of this, whiskey and soda in the morning, wine with lunch, champagne, port, and brandy with dinner and after. Not to the point of drunkenness usually, but constantly. He smoked 8 to 10 cigars a day. This schedule would kill most people. Churchill maintained it from his 60s into his 80s. Churchill's greatest weapon was his command of the English language. His speeches during 1940 to 1941, when Britain stood alone, are among the greatest in history. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that, if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour. But here's what many people don't know: Churchill worked obsessively on these speeches. He wasn't naturally eloquent in conversation, he actually had a speech impediment. A slight lisp, and he'd struggled with it his whole life. His brilliant oratory was the product of meticulous preparation, practice, and revision. He would write and rewrite speeches, rehearse them carefully, practice his timing and emphasis. Those seemingly spontaneous moments of brilliance? Carefully crafted and practiced, Churchill also coined phrases and concepts that shaped how we understand World War II: the Iron Curtain, the finest hour, blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He was a writer first. He'd won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1953, and he used language as a weapon. Throughout his life, Churchill battled severe depression. He called it his black dog, and it would descend on him without warning, plunging him into periods of despair, lethargy, and dark thoughts. He was terrified of the black dog. He avoided standing near the edge of railway platforms because he didn't trust himself not to jump. He kept himself frantically busy, in part, to outrun the depression, the drinking, the cigars, the manic work schedule. Some historians suggest these were partly self-medication, ways of managing his mental health in an era before we really understood depression or had effective treatments for it. During World War II, the black dog still came, but Churchill couldn't afford to give in to it. The country needed him. So he worked through it, kept moving, kept fighting, kept that famous jaw thrust out in defiance even when he was suffering internally. Churchill's staff lived in a state of exhausted terror. He was demanding to the point of cruelty, expecting people to work his insane hours, available at any moment of day or night. He would dictate memos at 2 a.m. He would call meetings at midnight. He would demand immediate answers to questions that required hours of research. He would lose his temper spectacularly if things weren't done to his satisfaction, but he was also surprisingly kind in unexpected moments. He'd send generous gifts, write thoughtful notes, show genuine concern for people who were sick or struggling. The man contained multitudes. His private secretaries developed a system. They'd rotate who had to work the night shift, and they'd warn each other about his moods. The Prime Minister is in one of his black dog moods, be careful. Or he's in a good mood, now's the time to bring up that thing he's been refusing. Churchill was married to Clementine Hosier for 57 years, and by all accounts, she was essential to his functioning. She managed their chaotic household, raised their children largely alone, handled his impossible moods, and served as his most trusted advisor. Clementine would write Churchill letters, even when they were in the same house, telling him when he was being unreasonable, when he needed to apologize to someone, when his behavior was unacceptable. He actually listened to her, which he rarely did with anyone else. Their children had a harder time. Churchill was a difficult father, absent, self-absorbed, emotionally volatile. His son Randolph became an alcoholic. His daughter Diana committed suicide. His daughter Sarah struggled with alcohol addiction. Only Mary, the youngest, seemed to have a relatively stable life. Churchill loved his children in his way, but he was too consumed by his own needs, his own demons, and his own sense of destiny to be a consistently present or emotionally available parent. After World War II, Churchill lost the 1945 election. The British people, grateful for his wartime leadership, nonetheless wanted a change. Churchill was devastated, but in 1946, out of power, he gave a speech at Westminster College in Missouri where he warned, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." Once again, Churchill saw a threat early. He recognized that the Soviet Union, recently an ally, was now a danger. He spent his final years warning about Soviet expansionism and advocating for Western unity. He returned as Prime Minister from 1951 to 1955, but he was old, increasingly unwell, and not the force he'd been during the war. He finally resigned at 80, and lived another decade, gradually fading as age and multiple strokes took their toll. He died on January 24, 1965, at age 90. His state funeral was one of the largest in history. Representatives from 112 nations attended. The cranes along the Thames River dipped in salute as his coffin passed. One final thing, Churchill was a serious writer. He published over 40 books, histories, biographies, memoirs, even a novel. His 6-volume History of World War II and his 4-volume The History of the English-Speaking Peoples are genuine works of history, albeit written from his particular perspective. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1953 for his mastery of historical and biographical description as well as for brilliant oratory in defending exalted human values. Writing was how Churchill made sense of his life, how he shaped his legacy, and not incidentally, how he made money. He was perpetually in debt, and his writing income was essential. So who was Winston Churchill? Really, he was a neglected child who spent his life desperate for recognition and love. He was a mediocre student who became one of the most eloquent speakers in history through sheer determination. He was a reckless glory seeker who threw himself into danger with suicidal courage. He was a spectacular failure who crashed repeatedly before his moment finally came. He was a man who battled severe depression his entire life, who feared his own darkness, who kept himself frantically busy to outrun the black dog. He worked impossible hours, drank heavily, smoked constantly, and maintained habits that should have killed him decades before they did. He was verbally brilliant but painstakingly prepared every word. He was demanding, difficult, often cruel to those around him, but also capable of unexpected kindness. He was a terrible father but a devoted, if dependent, husband, but he was also, in 1940, exactly the person Britain needed. When France fell, when America hadn't yet entered the war, when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany and the reasonable, prudent thing would have been to negotiate some kind of peace, Churchill refused. He rallied the nation with words and with will, and he held on until America entered the war and the tide turned. His flaws were immense. His failures were spectacular and numerous. His views on race and empire were indefensible. But in the single most important moment of the 20th century, he was the right person in the right place. Churchill isn't admirable in a simple way. He's fascinating, maddening, contradictory, and deeply flawed. He succeeded not despite his demons but perhaps because of them, the man who feared his own darkness so much that he worked obsessively to outrun it, who needed glory and recognition so desperately that he'd endure anything to achieve it, who was so convinced of his own destiny that he survived decades of failure waiting for his moment. That's the real Winston Churchill. Not a hero. Not a villain. A human being of staggering complexity who happened to be in the right place at the right time to do something genuinely heroic, even if the rest of his life and legacy remains deeply problematic. History isn't simple. Churchill certainly wasn't. And maybe that's the most important lesson, that the people who shape history are as complicated, flawed, and contradictory as anyone else. Churchill just happened to be complicated on a world historical scale.